Okay, so it's 12:47, so I'd like to welcome everyone to the Ohio Family Engagement Leadership Summit. We are so glad you could join us on this day of professional learning meant to take family school community partnership to the next level. My name is Hannah Lee, and I will be the moderator of this session. This session is session 12, How Schools and Families Can Promote Academic Success in Adopted Students. If you have any questions, concerns, or technical issues, please message me privately in the chat. If you like context hours for this session, a code will be provided at the end to enter a request form. Please be on the lookout for this session as it will only provide it once. To ensure that all get the most out of today, we ask that all participants turn off their webcams and microphones. But it seems like we have a smaller group of people, so feel free to use your camera and please actively engage in chat feature, and I will pass them along at an appropriate time if you have any questions. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Be sure to use the hashtag OHSummit24 to share your thoughts. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Eric Enderman, to you. Dr. Eric Enderman is a professor of educational psychology and of quantitative research, evaluation, and measurement at The Ohio State University. He received his PhD in educational psychology from the University of Michigan, and he holds a master's degree from Harvard University and a Bachelor of Science degree in Tufts University. His research over the past 25 years has focused on academic motivation. He is a fellow of both the American Psychological Association and the American Educational Research Association. He is the editor of the journal Theory in Practice, and he recently co-edited the third edition of Handbook of Educational Psychology with Lynn Cornell and the Visible Learning Guide to Student Achievement with Joan Henney. He is the co-author of 3 textbooks as well as over 100 peer-reviewed articles and invited chapters. His research has been featured in numerous media outlets, including CBS, NBC News, CNN, NPR, the Huffington Post, the Wall Street Journal, New York Magazine, and numerous other outlets. His research has been funded by a variety of agencies, including the Institute of Education Sciences, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and the National Institutes of Health. I am so excited to moderate your session and to learn from you, Dr. Enderman. The floor is now yours.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Are you hearing me okay? Okay, wonderful. All right, great. Well, I'm delighted to be here today and to chat with you all. And my goal for today is to give you a little bit of background on some of the special situations that adopted children and adolescents encounter and their families encounter, and how to manage those relationships with schools and to promote success in adopted youth. And I will, it is a smaller group, although it's getting bigger, which is good. But at the end, we can certainly have discussion about anything that would from the presentation. So I wanted to share a little bit about how I became interested in this topic. I've been a professor at Ohio State for 17 years, and before that I was at the University of Kentucky for 13 years, and I study motivation in adolescents, and I've been doing that for a long time. And it's only in the last few years that I really became interested in adopted populations, and the reason why is a personal one. So one of my children is adopted, and she's adopted from Cambodia. That's a picture of Siem Reap. And we adopted her when she was 10 months old. She was basically an infant, and she's now 22 and is doing great and just graduated college. But when she was growing up, my wife and I were really determined to really try to make sure that she gets exposed to her heritage, the Cambodian heritage, and we didn't know how to do that. So what we found was this wonderful organization called the Colorado Heritage Camps. I have little logo for them there. And this is an organization in Colorado that runs camps in the summer for adopted children and their families, and they do it by theme. So they had, for 10 years, we went every summer for about 5 days to Cambodian Heritage Camp. And it was kids from Cambodia who were adopted and their families. They had other weeks, it's adoptions from China and they had domestic adoption. And it was a wonderful experience for my daughter. It was a wonderful experience for our family. But that's also how my interest in this came up as a researcher, because going there for 10 years, I had conversations with families from all over the United States who had adopted kids and kept hearing the same stories over and over again about the challenges that their children were experiencing in school. And that sometimes the schools were really, really supportive and helpful, and sometimes the schools weren't, not because they weren't trying to be, but because they didn't really understand the unique needs of adopted youth. So at that point, that's when I started, and my wife, who's a professor also, she just retired last year, actually doing some research on this. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but I'm not going to focus too much on my research. I'm going to focus more on just generally what do we know about things we can do, the reasons that some adopted youth experience some challenges, and what we can do to help them as parents as well as educators. All right, so I wanted to just set the stage by talking about the status of adoptions in the United States, just to give you a broad context. And when you talk about adoption, we have to also talk about children in the foster care system who are not adopted, but they are not living with their biological family or an adopted family. So on any given day in the United States, this is based on national data, there are approximately 391,000 children in the foster care system. Of those 391,000 kids, 53% of them at some point get reunited with families or with relatives. 25% of them get adopted. There are some who do not. I'll come to them in a moment. In the last year that we have good national data for adoptions was 2021. And in 2021 in the United States, there were 53,000 actual completed adoptions. 55% of those were completed by foster parents. So those were the kids who were the 391,000 who were in the foster care system. 34% were adopted by a relative. All right. And then in looking at actually who adopts kids in the United States, 68% of adoptions are married couples, 25% single females, 3% single males, 4% unmarried couples. And the average age of adoption is 6 years. So sometimes, particularly in schools, there is this false belief that the kids who are adopted are all adopted as infants, and that's not correct. The average age is 6 years, so a lot of them are older than that. 93% of adopted families do rely on subsidies and post-adoption services to meet their kids' needs. And this is really important, this last one, 9% of the kids in the foster care system age out without emotional or financial support to succeed in life. That is really, really important to know, because these are kids who are really, they're just kind of put out there and don't have supports. They often have not had a great experience in school. There is no family for them to turn to, and there often are no social services for them to turn to. And when there are social services, it's very difficult for them to find them. Little history about adoption. Adoption actually started in the United States in the 19th century. I believe the first state approval for adoptions were in 1851. So they've been going on for a long time. Inter-country adoption began after World War II. Didn't really happen before then, and increased quite a bit following the Korean and the Vietnamese wars. Prior to the 1980s, most U.S. adoptions involved domestically born, healthy white children and parents of the same race. Cross-racial adoptions, international adoptions, cross-cultural really didn't happen much before the 1980s. And international adoption in the US peaked in 2004. In 2016, there were only a little over 5,000 visas issued for children being adopted. International adoption has decreased substantially. It's just not as is not as much as there used to be for many, many reasons. My daughter was one of the last children adopted out of Cambodia, and that was in 2002. It was the same year Angelina Jolie adopted her son from Cambodia. And those were among the last children who were allowed to be adopted out of Cambodia strictly for political reasons, which is really very, very disheartening because there are still many, many children in Cambodia and other countries who are living in orphanages who are potentially could be adopted, but there are, because of international legalities, this is not happening. And it's the needs of the children often are not what's thought about. All right, so getting into the heart of this presentation, what are some of the academic challenges for adopted youth? There's some general things, and then I'll go into some specifics. So adopted youth experience greater academic difficulties broadly, but there's very little evidence to say that there actually are differences in IQ or achievement in these kids. And this is really important. I'll come back to it. So what we're basically saying is they have the same potential, they have the same abilities, but it is more of something that happens in terms of their motivation, their engagement, their ability to connect with the school, their ability to self-regulate and engage in their work. And so it's not that they can't do it. It's not that they're not able to, but there is something that is preventing them from reaching their potential. Adopted youth, AY is my abbreviation. If you see that later, it means adopted youth, just to save space. Adopted youth are twice as likely to have their parents contacted by school personnel about schoolwork. And I can tell you generally, it's not calls that say that they're doing great in school. They're 3 times as likely to have their parents contacted by the school about behavior. And as we're going to come to in a few minutes, this is the really, really big challenge because there are many adopted youth who are have ADHD or some kind of behavioral disorder, and the schools don't sometimes realize that, and it gets construed as just this is a bad child. They're 4 times more likely to repeat a grade. And this is something else that research consistently finds. Achievement is lower when the adoption occurs after age 1. Now, that doesn't mean that it's bad to adopt kids after age 1, but there is something developmentally about age 1 that puts kids who were adopted after age 1 at a little more risk for experiencing academic difficulties. They're 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled. And another is interesting thing specifically about internationally adopted youth is that those who are not adopted until school age, so until they're basically older than when school begins, they do experience impaired intelligence, sometimes attention span, and significant reading and language deficits. All right, so there are other reasons why adopted youth experience difficulties in school as well. And these are things, again, as parents, that if any of you are adopted parents, you're all probably very aware of these, but school personnel sometimes are aware and sometimes are not aware. Trauma of separation and pre-adoption trauma. I can't really tell you how important that is and how real that is. And that's very invisible to many people. When children start learning things from the moment they're born, they are very, very perceptive. Their environment, they take everything in. And when children are adopted, at some point, unless they're adopted right after birth, there is a separation, and they are put into a very, very different context. And so there is a trauma of separation from whoever the caregiver might be. It could be a caregiver in an orphanage in many international adoptions. There also is pre-adoption trauma. We often don't know what adopted kids experienced before they were adopted. As much as I like to think I know what my daughter experienced those 10 months that she lived in an orphanage in Cambodia, I thought I knew. And then we went back to visit Cambodia and we visited the orphanage, and we found out when we visited, they said, oh, no, no, she wasn't at that orphanage. She was at the other orphanage. They just brought her to the one you got her from when the parents from the US came to pick them up. And we went to visit the other one, and the conditions were not very nice. So you often don't know with domestic adoptions as well what they may have experienced, and it matters in the sense that even though you weren't there, they were there, and it still was an experience for them. Prenatal exposure to drugs and alcohol obviously is for many kids um, that has effects on cognition, on health, time of adoption. Language exposure is another thing, particularly if children are not adopted at infant, right when they're infants, if they are from another country or if they are coming from a situation where the language that you speak, assuming it's English, was not spoken, they are going to be suddenly thrust into an environment when they're adopted where suddenly nothing sounds right. The language is very, very different. My daughter for 10 months heard Khmer. That is the language that is spoken in Cambodia. She did not hear, it does not sound like English. And suddenly, boom, she's at the other side of the world hearing English. All right. And she did just fine and adjusted, but that has effects because those kids simply did not, it's not just that they're learning a new language, but it's like just incredible shock to their system. Like everything is different, everything looks different, everything sounds different. Early nutrition also affects later cognitive development. And 54% of parents who have adopted kids do report problems with ability to learn, their ability to get along with other kids, their ability to engage in physical activities. This is what, when I said we went every summer to the camp that we took our daughter to, this is what all those parents were saying. Now I have the statistics to back it up, but just talking to people, there were so many who experienced this. Little more about academic challenges. Oops. Nope, I didn't move that. Okay. So some research on adopted youth, adopted children in terms of their academics and academic success and academic difficulties. They're obviously vulnerable to experiencing a lot of academic problems. Some of the research indicates lower academic performance, but not all of it. And so that's something really important here. I'm talking about this. There are many, many adopted kids who none of this is true for, who just, they do great. They don't experience this. Statistically, much more often, kids who are adopted do experience these difficulties, but there are many who don't. And another, they are twice as likely as non-adopted youth to be referred for special education services. And that's sort of a double-edged sword. If they actually do have a need for special education and they have a documentable disability, then absolutely they would want a 504 and an IEP and to get those services. Sometimes they are referred because the maybe not for the right reasons, though, just because maybe they're difficult to deal with, and that's maybe not necessarily because of something that really needs to have special education. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Okay, just some statistics for you, just to show you. I'm not going to go through all of these, but the blue lines here, the blue lines represent this is based on US national data. So this is representative of the United States. The blue bars represent adopted students, the yellow represent non-adopted students. And you can see that with various psychological and health conditions, there are big differences. The ones I want to point out in particular is attention deficit disorder. If you look at that, that's the second one. 36% of adopted kids are eventually identified as having attention deficit disorder, ADHD. Only 11% in the general population. 23% get identified as having a specific learning disability, only 6% in the general population. So these are big differences. This next one is looking at severe emotional disturbance and other psychological or physical conditions. And again, the differences now this is a little misleading because the chart here is based on the scale is different, but nevertheless, severe emotional disturbance, you can see 3% in the general population, 12% in the adopted population. Severe intellectual disability, 2% in the general population, 7% in the adopted population. So there are very real differences here. All right. Now, one of the other.
There was a question from the chat.
Sure.
So for those families who don't have camps for support, what might be another resource for families who are facing these different challenges for their adopted children?
Excellent question. So there are one of the things I learned is there's really sort of, there are many social services, but there are so many adoption support groups that you can join through social media. I had no idea that they existed, and I discovered they existed when we started doing research on this, is because when we started doing the research, which I'm not going to really talk too much about that, but our big question was, well, how do we find these families? And we discovered that in the 21st century, it's through social media. There are adoption support groups online that are both their online groups, and you can connect with groups that also meet in person. And there's so many connections then through those groups. It's tremendous. I found them all through Facebook. My kids make fun of me because Facebook's for old people, but they're probably available through other resources as well. That is one of the primary ways that these supports you can find them, and they're phenomenal. I joined a lot of these groups with permission of the group when we were doing research, and the support that people provide for each other, the information, the resources are really, really wonderful. In terms of identity development, this is a really big part of this, and this is really a place where as parents, you need to advocate for your kiddos with the school, because schools sometimes, this is the part, they often do realize about some of the more easily identifiable issues that our kids struggle with, but identity is one that's hidden, but it's very, very real. So adopted kids are thinking about a lot of things all the time. And every adopted kid at some point will be thinking, why was I given up by my birth parents? Who were my birth parents? What is their story? Do I have siblings? And race and ethnicity, this is extraordinarily important. Who am I? There are many, many adopted kids who are not the same color as their parents. My daughter's from Cambodia. She has very dark skin. My wife and I are white, and we have a son who's white. And this has been something her whole life until now that has been real for her, very real for her. And that's something that we as parents learn constantly about how to support this, but you have to be aware of it. And you have to be aware of it when they go to school, because sometimes the teachers don't know that. If you have sometimes we would go to a parent conference and we'd walk in and the teacher would look, oh, you're her parents? And that does not, that just does not go well for the kid when that gets said. The other thing is that the kids struggle with, who am I? So if you are a child who has dark skin and you live with a family where the other people in the family have white skin, and you maybe come from another country, or maybe you come from another state, or you don't know where you came from, you ask the question, who am I? And that's really, really challenging for adopted kids. And the reason it's important to know is that's what's going on in their heads a lot of the time. So when a teacher sometimes says to a parent of an adopted child, she's not paying attention. Sometimes the teacher, and I'm not blaming the teacher, they don't know it, doesn't realize that, well, she's not paying attention because she's got to think about these other things, and she will think about them that other kids who are not adopted don't. So the struggle with identity, if you are really thinking about who am I, why am I where I am and who I am, that takes up cognitive space. Humans cognitively, we can't, as much as people think we can multitask and do many things at a time, we can't. We can't. The science is pretty clear on that. I mean, you can, but you can't do it well. So if kids are dealing with, particularly during the adolescent years, struggling with these identity issues, all adolescents struggle with identity, but adopted kids even more than others, that just affects how much they're not going to be able to think about solving an algebra problem as well as somebody who's not. Okay, so really quickly, my area, excuse me, my research is on motivation, and we turned some of this to looking at motivation, excuse me, in adopted youth. When we started looking at this, we realized there was almost nothing on research-wise, I mean, really like good research, empirical research on motivation in adopted youth. So we did some work, and I can send you, if any's interested, more. But one of the things we looked at was motivation in math, and we found that adopted youth compared to non-adopted youth find math less interesting. And this is after controlling for everything imaginable. We found that internationally adopted youth like math and science less and have lower confidence in their abilities in math than either domestically or non-adopted youth. So when we talk about motivation, I'm talking about a lot of different things. I'm talking about motivation is a broad topic. So motivation has to do with how confident a child feels when they're doing their school work, which varies by subject. A child may feel very confident doing music and not doing mathematics. It has to do with their achievement values, how much they like what they're studying. People often don't pay attention to how important that is, but when we go do things to make kids realize that learning something can be fun, or it can be useful, or it can help you get a job in the future, that makes a big difference. Learning has to do with our goals, and learning has to do with our attributions, and this is a big one. When a child or anyone gets a bad grade on a test, in their head, they're thinking, why? And there are many, many reasons that people come up with for why. And if people make attributions to, well, I didn't do well because I didn't study last night because I was goofing off with my friends, that's something you can fix. If you make the attribution to, well, I'm just stupid, which many kids do, that is really difficult. And adopted kids may be more likely to make the attribution to there's something wrong with me because I'm adopted. And that's something we can fix. But if it's going on in their head, that's going to be very debilitating to them. One of the other things we did research on, which was really pretty, I think, a surprising finding is, so one of the things that predicts academic success for kids in general is school belonging. I'm sure you've all heard that. School belonging means you feel comfortable in your school, you feel like you have people who listen to you, you have people who you can talk to. It's a place where you feel like I'm part of this some way. That is good for everyone, whether you're adopted or you're not adopted. What we found for adopted kids was this top box identifying with one's ethnic group. If a child identifies with their ethnic group, whatever that might be, and it's going to vary tremendously depending on the circumstances, but if they feel this identification, they're going to feel more belonging at school. And that's going to lead to positive academic outcomes. But exploration of identity, this was interesting. If they are really still exploring that and kind of still trying to figure out, it goes back to the identity thing, exploring their identity and trying to figure out, who am I? They feel less belonging. And if they feel less belonging, that's going to affect them again in the long term in terms of their achievement. Oops. I also want to say, please keep in mind that many adopted kids do really, really well in school. So, I'm talking about difficulties, but I want to acknowledge many, many don't have difficulties, or the difficulties are quite limited. So what are some things we can do getting into to support kids who are adopted? First of all, parental education on adoption and developmental issues varies widely by state and agency. So when people adopt, there are very, very different requirements in terms of through social workers about what usually you work with a social worker and what parents need to do to be able to go through the adoption process in terms of learning. We adopted our daughter. We lived in Kentucky. It was at the University of Kentucky at the time. And they had really, really strict requirements in terms of what parents had to go through in terms of learning with social workers before you could be approved for the process. So we learned a lot that we thought we knew, but we didn't know about just generally what are the needs of kids when they're adopted, and what are some of the responsibilities parents need to attend to and be aware of. Teachers and other professionals receive very little preparation in supporting adopted students. Before I went back to grad school, I taught high school for a couple of years. I went through a teacher licensure program. Nobody said a word to me about adopted kids. I knew nothing about the special needs of adopted kids. Um, I teach a course now. I'm part of I organize the big intro educational psychology course at Ohio State. And I make sure that in that course, they have some discussion about this, but that's because I know it's important and I think it's important and I make sure it gets in there. But a lot of teachers don't really learn much about this. And adopted parents often have to end up educating themselves and advocating for their child with some expert assistance. One of the things also I wanted to just share, because parents can say this better than me, in some of the research we did, we asked parents of adoptees, so these are parents who have adopted children or adolescents, what, if anything, do you wish your adopted child's teachers, past or present, better understood about them? One of the things we were really, really surprised at is when we did this research, how many adopted family parents wanted to participate. When we do research and we try to get people to participate, it's not easy. I'm sure you all get things of your email like complete this survey and participate in this, and you hit delete, as many of us do. When we created this research and reached out to adopted families, we were overwhelmed with how many said yes. And they actually said, thank you for asking us, because nobody's ever asked us. So one of the things we did is we asked them, what do you think wish your kids' teachers knew? I just wanted to share some of the responses. This is one parent who said early on in first grade, one teacher was reluctant to change a family tree assignment to include non-family members, non-traditional family members. But in our family, we have people not related by blood as part of our family. My daughter included them in the assignment, although the teacher tried to keep it just to extended family. Another said, her teachers have always been sensitive to adoptive children. For example, in biology class, when they were testing genetics and comparing traits with their family, the teacher had a plan in place for kids who were not genetically tied to their parents or guardians, without calling those students out or making them feel excluded or different. That's very, very rare. Warms my heart when I hear something like this. The other is that just about every child gets asked to do the family tree. And again, it's with adopted kids, that's not the easiest assignment to do for so many reasons. How her adoption experience affected her social development and interactions. She really struggled with impulse control, mainly, I think, because she was always trying to protect herself. She got in a lot of trouble in preschool and kindergarten because of it. How much she struggles with attachment and trusting adults. And this is a long one, but it's, I think, worth hearing. I've tried to educate the teachers in the school over time about kids who have experienced trauma and adoption in general. Because she's such a good kid who does well socially and academically, there haven't been a lot of times when I've had to intervene. I do every year explain to her homeroom teacher about how she feels as an adopted person, the sense of loss of not being good enough, so they understand her and share that information with other teachers and adults she might be interacting with. One of her favorite teachers has been a great ally in that he is super supportive of helping her ease the anxiety she has about all things academic. She does well in his class and she loves him, and he's a friend of mine. He's been great at understanding what's going on with her and helping her learn coping strategies to minimize worry. All right. So, what can we do? What are some things that we can do as parents and teachers to support academic success in adopted youth? First of all, communication. You, as a parent, you have to be an advocate for your child. And again, it's not that teachers in any way don't want to do the right thing. They do. I was a teacher, I do, but teachers often don't know. They don't know about the special circumstances that adopted kids face. And many times a teacher will have no idea that a child is adopted. And you may not want to let the teacher know. That's going to be individual depending on the situation. Early intervention is very important. Doing things to promote school and family belonging with the school. If a child is not feeling that sense of belonging, again, sometimes as a parent, we have to advocate and say, well, what is this? Why? Is it something, does the school not have an opportunity? Is it not creating a place that's accepting? And what can I do to help facilitate that? Study skills. This is one of the really, really big ones, particularly for kids who've been identified as having attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And I'm going to say more about that in a minute. Requesting support and services and assessments, be an advocate. If you think your child might have something going on like a learning disability or ADHD, if they are adopted, statistically, they are more likely to have that. Sometimes you as the parent may have to go in and say, I want this assessment, I want the evaluation to get the services. That is your right as a parent. Be aware of adopted youth's multiple identities. This identity issue is just a really important. And helping them set short-term goals. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Language also matters. The language we use and the language teachers use. And sometimes we can help teachers to use the language. So these are little things, little subtle things that might not even give a second thought to, but to an adopted child, they're very meaningful. So saying something like, your birth mother or your first mother or father or family, as opposed to your real mother or natural mother. Whenever somebody says that to the child, that means, oh, does that mean mom and dad are not my real parents? Instead of saying we could not have a child born to us, saying we could not have our own child. But that acknowledges, but we still have a child, we have you. They were not able to take care of a child, any child at that time, as opposed to your birth parents were not able to take care of you, because again, the focus for the child is, oh, it was something about you, because they wonder, why was I the one put up for adoption? Using the term inter-country adoption instead of foreign adoption, and saying when talking about a child's adoption, using language that says your birth family or the judge made a plan for you to be adopted, as opposed to they just gave you up. Little things like language like that make a big, big difference. All right, I want to give you, before we finish up and have questions, one strategy that I think you can use, and this is helpful for all kids, but particularly for kids who are having difficulties academically, and this works for if any children have ADHD. One of the easiest things we can do is to help kids, and again, working with their teachers, help teachers to set short-term goals as opposed to long-term goals. When we set short-term goals for ourselves as opposed to long-term goals, we're more motivated. Let me give you an example everyone can relate to. I'm sure everybody's tried dieting, including me, all right? Many, many times, it'll be the new year, and let's say somebody says, my goal this year is I'm gonna lose 25 pounds. That's my goal. And you start dieting and you exercise and you're doing all the good things in January, and you weigh yourself, and after the first week, you weigh yourself and you've lost a pound. And you say, all right, well, that's some progress. And you keep doing that stuff, and then the second week, you lose another pound. And you say, all right, well, it's just another pound. And by the third week, you do all that and you work really hard and you exercise and you eat well, and you've still just lost a pound. And most people, when they think of that, I'm never going to get to 25. And many, many people just stop. All right. And that happens with a lot of us. Now, let me tell you the story a different way. Suppose that it's New Year's and your resolution or mine is I'm going to lose 1 pound per week. No 25. Forget about the 25 pounds. I'm going to lose 1 pound per week. That's my goal. That's a short-term goal. Well, after the first week, I do everything. I've lost a pound. Now I feel good. Second week, I've lost a pound. I feel good. Guess what happens after 25 weeks? You've lost the 25 pounds. The only difference is that you set a different goal. We can do this with our kids. So kids get assignments in school that they find overwhelming because sometimes it's presented as a long-term goal. So for example, we're going to read this book and it's a big book. And they look at it and say, like, oh my God, I can't read that book. I'll never get it done. You're going to write a report. You're going to learn how to speak French. You're going to learn to play tennis. These are all things that are very daunting. And as our kids start doing these things, they often get frustrated and they feel like they're making no progress and they stop. All right, so let me give you some different ways to think about this. Different way to think about it would be saying, how can we help our child set short-term goals? So let's say child is learning a new foreign language, as kids often at some point learn to speak a foreign language in school. So let's say the teacher says, we're doing a unit where we're going to learn how to count to 20 and do math problems in Spanish. All right. And this is for a child who's never spoken Spanish, is taking Spanish 1 in maybe middle school or ninth grade. And that's very, very daunting. Different way to do that to make the child feel successful if you're working with the child at home, or maybe to encourage the teachers to say, rather than that, say, by tomorrow, we're going to learn how to count to 5 in Spanish. You're going to count forward, you're going to count backward, and you're going to be really able to do it and feel great. And you just work on uno, dos, tres, cuatro, cinco. You just learned 5. And then the next day you say, now we're going to go up to 10. And you set a little bigger goal. And then the next day you say, now we're going to go up to 13. And then the next day you say, now we're going to play with the numbers we already know and do some real simple math and say, let's do 2 plus 2, but do it in Spanish. And you set these little tiny goals each day that are easy for the child to achieve and they feel successful. That is what motivates them to the next day to keep going. At the end of the 2 weeks, they will know how to count to 20 and do the math problems. But if the goal in their head is just this learning how to count to 20 and doing the problems, they're going to get frustrated and give up. You can do the same kind of thing if you're talking about maybe learning how to play a song on a violin. If they're new to that, learning how to play the whole song is very daunting. Well, let's learn how to just play the first, 5 notes today. And tomorrow we'll add 5 more notes and you experience success. Same thing with something like learning how to add fractions. Adding fractions is very traumatic for many, many, many people. Sure, lots of us learning math, learning fractions is challenging. There's a process to adding fractions, all right? And it's not, and so again, learning just these little steps one at a time rather than the big picture. Learning how to solve algebra problems. The first time somebody sees 2x plus 8 equals 18, they might say, I can't do that. I once had someone who was say, X is a letter. These are numbers, and not even realizing what a variable is. So taking it really, really, really slowly, one step at a time, is a strategy that can be extremely helpful. And again, sometimes we can suggest this gently to teachers and say, can you break it down into smaller parts? That I can't tell you how helpful that is for academic success. So I'm going to stop there and just open it up for discussion and questions and anything you might like to talk about. And I have my email here. I added a few slides, so if you, yes,
Excuse the
I'll send.
We have Kona Island raffle winners from 3rd grade. I have this in Redwood.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Tanya, can you unmute yourself and say the question again or drop your question to the chat?
I'm sorry, I accidentally hit that. What you were hearing is our school's announcements going on right now. So that was, I accidentally unmuted and the announcements are going on.
All right, no worries.
That's
Reality. So I haven't been able to follow the chat, so I don't know if there were questions in the chat. But if anybody has an experience that they would like to share with the group, that would be wonderful too. We do have a small group. And if not, that's okay too.
I have a question. First of all, this presentation was fantastic, so thank you so much for touching on this topic. You did talk a little bit about parents advocating for their adopted children who are struggling in school academically. Is it common that children who are adopted struggle with academics? Is that, because I'm looking through the lens of educators always look at children who have disabilities or learning disabilities are the ones who have those challenges. And no one really looks through those lens of those children who are adopted. Is that something that you find is showing more and more, that adopted children are showing these challenges in the academic space?
Yes, great question. And the answer is yes, but it's not because they're adopted necessarily. It's because I showed that slide earlier with the bar chart. It's because of the many times that the adopted kids are just statistically more likely than non-adopted to experience some of the very real learning challenges like ADHD, like autism or mild autism, like having a learning disability. And so there's that on top of, I can't tell you how much, going back to the issue of trauma and early language exposure and the fact that they have not been exposed necessarily to the same language environment as their classmates during the first few years of their life, that just creates a gap for them. And then the identity issue is tremendous. And again, that's something I always refer to it as hidden because you don't see that, but that creates a huge academic roadblock for a lot of these students because they are, like I said, if they are really ruminating on and understandably being thinking about who am I? Where did I come from? Why was I, what happened to this other family? They cannot concentrate on their schoolwork. Our brains just can't do that. And teachers just don't realize that. And again, and as parents, we have to sometimes go to the teacher and make them aware. I told you when I was a new teacher, I wouldn't have known any of this. I would have had no idea. And so now I think we do have to advocate. And my wife and I had to do this a lot for our daughter. Sometimes we had to occasionally gently tell a teacher some of the story. You also, with adopted families, sometimes you want to share your story and it's your child's story, and sometimes you don't, or sometimes you might not want to share the whole story. So you have to be sensitive to what the child wants as well and what you're comfortable with.
Yeah,
I hope that answers.
it does. That makes complete sense. Thank you so much.
And can I add to that too, please? I am an intervention specialist and an itinerant teacher, but and this is my 25th year teaching. But for this subject, I have 6 special needs adopted kids that were adopted between the ages of 3 and 8 years old, and, from 4 different families. But, and they're all ended up being special needs. But the biggest thing too is, like you said, with sharing and how much do you wanna share, and, some of my adopted kids do look like me, so people would not even think that they are adopted because they do have similar features. But like my one daughter has fetal alcohol syndrome. So, when you start to share that your child had my daughter has fetal alcohol syndrome, then they think that somehow you have to express that the child is adopted, because then they look at you and think, "Oh, well, you drink when you were pregnant," or "My daughter is a victim of shaken baby syndrome," or, I mean, all of these different things that you have to keep bringing up, that there's all of these judgments, and then you're having to constantly label your child, and it just ends up getting in the way and really causing a problem for the child. And then, unfortunately, 4 of my children have been diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder, which is a whole nother realm of things, especially with dishonesty and distrust and all of that. So, but the education system and actually our church also were very big barriers to helping us to build community around our family because of all of the judgments and the kids' behavior and um, just other issues. But
Yeah.
I really appreciate you even bringing this topic up so that people can learn.
Well, thank you, and thank you for sharing that. And I think, you bring up an important issue about another double-edged sword is the labeling. So if there's the whole issue, let's take fetal alcohol syndrome. Obviously there's the issue of what people will think and whether or not you want to share that they're adopted or not. But then even when you get past that, now having the school know about that, that's a good thing in many ways because they can provide services, but it also sometimes is problematic because they will never look at that child the same way again. It's like, and that's like when you think, I always use the example of when you watch TV drama, court shows, and somebody says, strike that, the jury will pretend they didn't hear it. Well, you've heard it, you've heard it. So again, as a parent, we have to think, well, do I want them to know it was fetal alcohol syndrome, or they want them maybe to just know that there were some serious medical issues earlier in life, and they have affected the way that my son or daughter processes information now. And I don't want to go into the detail. And sometimes we have to maybe not tell the whole story to protect the child. Every family is different this way. So that's why you're bringing up wonderful points, but there are many, many challenges. And again, it's, schools aren't aware, teachers aren't aware, but so we want to advocate and educate. And again, I can't say enough, not blame teachers, because I was one of those teachers. You don't know what you don't know. So sometimes we have to do that extra work to help them understand what our kids need.
And one of the other things too is, like you brought up, the family tree is always having to send in a baby picture. Oh my gosh. My kids have faked that they are other kids and just got copies of baby pictures just to pretend that they're theirs because we don't have any.
And why does it have to be a baby picture? Why can't it be a picture of a memory
Right.
that they enjoyed, whether it was in the park or,
Mhm.
yeah, I agree,
And then
Teresa.
another stigma that we have
Exactly. And
had,
that's why,
I'm sorry, another stigma that we have had is, being foster and adoptive parents in the beginning, adopting 6 children, the school just has this view of us as like, oh my gosh, why did they adopt so many kids? Didn't they know what they were getting into? Well, no, you really don't know what you're getting into. And, who are they to judge how many kids we've adopted or, just that sort of thing? But coincidentally, one of my with God's sense of humor, I now have a biological child too that is gifted. So then whenever she goes to school, they're like, "Oh my gosh, there's another Reed kid." Well, this kid is profoundly gifted. So it's like I don't know.
Well, that exacerbates the situation when, I mean, that was in my family. We have our son is our biological child and our daughter's adopted, and she's younger than him. And, she was always, experienced that, oh, you're Jacob's sister? And that happens with all kids, but with adopted kids, it's multiplied by so much more, like all the really important issues you're bringing up.
And I think that educators should really look at the whole child, regardless of the background, whether they're biological or not. And sometimes that kind of, depending on where you are in the state, that will fall in between the cracks. So I loved that you mentioned parent advocacy, because that's when our parents have to really strengthen their advocacy for their children.
One real quick resource that I wanted to share is you had talked about the number of children that age out of foster care without any supports. One thing that Ohio Means Jobs has done a decent job with now is they have basically like caseworkers for high school students that are transitioning into adulthood that help them get the resources they need to maintain employment, to have access to clothing, to help them get their driver's license, different things like that, that is out there now at Ohio Means Jobs. But a lot of people don't know about that program. And I just recently learned of it for one of my students that I'm working with because my kids are older now. But that would have been a godsend then, because there are so many kids that are aging out of the system that do not have any supports whatsoever and do not feel connected to their families, because some of them, like the girl that I'm working with, is in a group home. There's no family connection or anything there, and her family was very abusive, so she's definitely not going back there.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that resource. I didn't know about that one. So that's really wonderful to know. I know we only have about 1 minute left. I will be sending the updated slides to to the Family Engagement Center. So you'll be able to get those. You saw I had a few more slides in there. I think we're just about done. I want to thank you all. This has been really, I love talking about this topic. I'm glad it was an audience who was really engaged and appreciated it. And this is something I'm still learning about all the time. Even though my daughter's 22, I'm still learning all kinds of stuff about how to manage the relationship now as adults. So there's always learning. But thank you all. Really, really appreciate your coming. Thanks so much.